Well, my next guest was also on hand to hear the apology today in the House of Commons. Shimon Fogel is the Chief Executive Officer for the Centre for Israel and Jewish Affairs, and he has been pressing the Canadian government for years to acknowledge this country's failure to act to save those refugees aboard the MS St. Louis, and he's with me now. Good to see you.
Thanks
for coming to speak with me. It was a powerful day in the House of Commons today. This is an important day for Canada. You've waited a long time to hear the Prime Minister's formal apology. What does having that apology mean to you?
I think for the Jewish community, for the survivor community, some of whom were able to participate today, it's tremendous validation. It confirms and acknowledges a very dark period in Canada's history, but it also represents something very special in that we as a country have learned from our past, and our posture today is much more constructive and supportive of those who are vulnerable and in need than back in the 30s and 40s.
Let me ask you this: on a personal note, did you have any family members or relatives on the St. Louis?
So I didn't have any on the St. Louis. Both my parents were survivors. They came to Canada and built a new life, and it's that sense of promise that I think we're able to celebrate, even in the context of something that was a shameful episode in Canada's history.
Let me pick up on something you've touched on. Why is it important for countries to apologize for mistakes of the past when there will be millions of Canadians who weren't around, aren't familiar with the story? They'll be much more familiar after today. But why is it important for us to acknowledge those mistakes of the past?
Well, I think that absent an ability to confront our mistakes, we don't have a way to learn going forward. But more importantly, there are important lessons to be derived from World War II. It's a period that, as you're suggesting, has faded from the memories of many. Younger Canadians really have no context, no terms of reference for it. And if our experience in the past is going to form our approach to challenges today and tomorrow, then it's important for us to be able to look back, acknowledge what we did wrong, celebrate what we did right, because there were times when we did some really heroic things as a country, but it helps us calibrate ourselves in meeting the challenges of today and tomorrow.
It's really important. I think you've talked about this before, but the need to today represents, in many ways, it's an event. I mean, having the apology actually puts the whole issue back in the spotlight for so many more Canadians. How do we ensure as a society that an apology has a lasting benefit beyond today?
I think when an apology is offered, and it's offered in the right context, drawing a connection between a past experience and future behavior, it allows us to create a seamless continuity in terms of how a country approaches things. And as it relates to the Jewish community, I think that it resonates particularly strongly right now, Peter, because anti-Semitism hasn't disappeared. And if we can't generate the resolve to push back against anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination, then we are so vulnerable to falling back into those indifferent and even callous attitudes that today the Prime Minister acknowledged.
We have a few minutes here, so I think it's important to and some of it's covered in the apology, but a chance to sort of look back on that time and what was taking place. Take us back to that time in our history, because I know you've written about it. What was the climate that allowed Canada to say no to a boatload of Jewish refugees looking for a place to land and looking for a place to escape what was happening in Europe at the time?
Well, the St. Louis is really a symbol for something much larger, as you're suggesting. And it was a time when increasingly it was evident that Jews were at risk and under threat from the Nazis and their collaborators. And there were frenetic efforts to try and direct Jews away from those places where they were confronting that kind of existential threat. And the international community was pretty indifferent to it. It wasn't just Canada. It was other European countries. It was the United States. It was Central and South Americans. And it it generated a sense of bleakness for Jews, and they write about it and speak about it then and now, about simply not having options.
And you've looked into this, and because people wondering probably, well, what was the thinking? What was the thinking that would allow a country to turn away a boatload of desperate people? And you've looked into this somewhat, and and it's kind of interesting because I think there's a real need to connect decisions to the public policy discussions that were taking place at the time, and to get an idea of that, like somebody down on the dock doesn't decide to turn a boat away. This came from the highest offices in the land.
Right, that's exactly right. And really what I think the Prime Minister was apologizing for today was a policy that we refer to as none is too many. When a senior civil servant was asked, well, how many Jews should we allow in? The response was, none is too many. And that became the title of a now famous book by Irving Abella and Hesh Tropper, where they documented the back and forth exchanges between politicians and senior civil servants as they were struggling to figure out what should their approach be to the challenge.
And the Prime Minister,
of
Mackenzie
Jews.
King, at the time. Yeah. I mean, this was at the highest levels of government, obviously.
Right, and the St. Louis was simply a reflection of a broader policy that said, we aren't going to be part of the solution. We aren't going to provide safe haven because we don't want Jews in Canada. And that reflected a broader and more entrenched anti-Semitic attitude that has since been repaired in large part.
And worth pointing out at that time, during this period where Jews were persecuted in Europe in particular, Canada took in, I think, over the 12-year period, 33 to 45, a total of 5,000.
Yeah, just a handful of Jews. And
at a time of crisis in the world. Yeah. Okay, let's finish on this. So, I guess is that really the lesson here? The lesson is partly that the apology gets to some measure undo a wrong, but also sheds light on the thinking of people at the highest levels in the land when these decisions are made, and that Canadians need to know that.
So in Jewish tradition, and this happens every year during the High Holy Day period, when you're looking for repentance and stuff for your own life, there's a process that you go through. And the two important elements are an acknowledgement of the past and resolve about the future. And I think with today's apology, the formal apology that he offers in the House, the Prime Minister is saying we are acknowledging the past, and that is feeding our resolve for the future about how we're going to deal with refugee situations of those who are vulnerable from all parts of the world.
Which the government is wrestling with now. I mean, there are parallels here?
There are absolutely parallels because discrimination and hatred didn't end with the armistice that we'll be marking in just a few days. So for me personally, as somebody who's been a beneficiary of everything good in Canada, it's actually very heartening to know that what is being reaffirmed today isn't just acceptance of responsibility for a terrible chapter in Canadian history, but an expression and a commitment of resolve to not be indifferent to those in need going forward.
Shimon Fogel, thanks so much for your perspective today. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Peter.